Welcome, everybody. My name is Ryan G. Hinds. I'm a counselor for the Ontario region and second vice president of Equities Council. Super excited to get this workshop started, as I'm sure all of you are. But before we start, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement statement as well as Equities Statement of Affirmation. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, and we offer our respect and our gratitude to the traditional caretakers of Toronto, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I live beside the Humber River, which has been a site of human activity for thousands and thousands of years. And as some of us have already done in the chat, I invite all of you to share where you're participating from today and to feel free to add the names of the indigenous peoples where you are. Equity's statement of information, which we always information of affirmation, which we always read at every equity gathering. Equity embraces an open and inclusive environment and encourages respectful behavior that affirms the dignity of all individuals. Equity further recognizes our shared responsibility for vigilance in creating and maintaining this environment. Equity recognizes a shared history with Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. In honor of those who have gone before us, Equity commits to working toward understanding and actionable practices of reconciliation. So today is the second in a series of workshops and seminars Equity is doing. We're really excited to bring you them because they're pretty important topics to both members and the industry at large. We grateful, and when I say we, I mean Equity, not me and my cat, who are the people who are here in my apartment today. Equity gratefully acknowledges the Government of Canada for the funding of these programs through the Department of Canadian Heritage as a part of the Canada Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund. After the workshop, we'll be sending you a link to complete a brief survey. We'd love to get your feedback on these workshops and your guidance as we plan future ones, because there'll be more coming, and we'd love to tailor them to exactly what you all are looking for and what you all feel you'd appreciate not learning about. As usual, if you have a question, I encourage you to use the raise hand option. It should be at the bottom of your screen. There's a hand icon. You can click that, or put your question in the Q&A section. There's a Q&A button beside the hand section. And we ask this because if you put questions in the chat, they may get lost. And using raise hand or Q&A is a really great way to ensure we get to them. And now for our guests for this seminar, really excited to welcome them. They're all wonderful people who I really respect. Charles C. Smith is a poet, playwright, and essayist who has written and edited 12 books. He studied poetry and drama with William Packard, editor of the New York Quarterly magazine at New York University, and Herbert Berghoff Studios. He also studied drama at Frank Silvera's Writers' Workshop in Harlem. Charles was the founder of the Black Perspectives Cultural Program in Regent Park and recently received a grant from the Ontario Arts Council's Writers' Reserve Grants Program and the Toronto Arts Council's Writers' Grants Program. Welcome, Charles. Sheila Wilmot has been engaged in collaborative consulting work with arts organizations since 2014 in the intersecting areas of conflict resolution and equity-focused practice. Topics have particularly included an attention to whiteness and racism. The work has included research, workshop design and delivery, training and policy guide development, and conflict mediation. She teaches in the Community Engagement, Development, and Leadership Certificate Program at Ryerson University, the Chang School. Do we still say Ryerson University? We say TMU. Toronto Metropolitan
Toronto
University.
Metropolitan, yes.
Okay, TMU is convincing because I think the Marvel universe. So I I don't know what to say anymore. She successfully negotiated equity-related contract provisions and effectively represented union members in human rights-focused grievances and complaints. Welcome, Sheila. And finally, Sedina Fiati is a Toronto-based facilitator, artist, and activist. She is currently artist activist in residence with Nightwood Theatre and nearing completion after 3 years with Generator as training consultant for the Artist Producer Training Program and a member of their Strategic Advisory Committee. She was the co-chair of ACTRA Toronto's Diversity Committee and ACTRA Toronto Councillor and second vice president of Council for Canadian Actors Equity Association. Not only was she second vice president of Equity Council, Sedina was the second vice president immediately before me and was just so helpful in helping me learn the reins and figure out what to do and how to work with equity. So thank you, Sedina. I can't say thank you enough times. She is one of the founding members of the Black Pledge Collective. And now, Charles, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan, and welcome everyone. I did put the agenda into the chat room, and I'll just share screen now so we can go over it together, and then we'll get on with the conversation. So yes, we're honored to be invited by Canadian Actors Equity to have this conversation with you, and the focus will be on community engagement and arts practices, how we consider equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging in your work. Ryan's already given a very wonderful land acknowledgement, and it's good to see others are writing into the chat room, recognizing the communities, the nations that are within their communities. That is so important to recognize when we say time immemorial, what does that mean? Who are the people, et cetera. So, we don't need to do the land acknowledgement. It's going to go through the agenda, and then we'll get into the process. We're going to set the context. So I'm going to start with a couple of minutes of some PowerPoints that will begin to open up some of the conversation. We did send you some text previously that hopefully you've had a chance to look at. A glossary of terms, which is so important. And how do we look at terminology these days? What is the difference between equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, anti-oppression, decoloniality, all those kinds of things. So you have a couple of materials that the key terms, as well as PowerPoints on language usage in this day and age. It's so important to stay on top of it, to understand it, because this is how people self-identify. And that is critically important in terms of how we see ourselves in the world. So I'll present that, and then we'll have an open plenary. You'll see this open plenary will happen in between the speakers. We encourage you to ask questions, raise comments, however you feel you wish, as Ryan was pointing out, either in Q&A or raising your hand so that we can see it and then open that up. Following that, then Sedina will talk about systemic oppression. And then after that, there'll be an open plenary where people can talk to Sedina, raise questions, comments as well. We anticipate a health break around 3:25 for about 15 minutes, because looking at these Zoom screens, even though it's helping us to connect across the country, it's been over 2 years and it gets a bit tiring at times. And, we need to take our eyes away from this thing and, shake off whatever. Then we come back and Sheila will lead the next session on community engagement and decision-making. And again, following her, there'll be an opportunity to speak to her directly about her thoughts. When we get to about 4 o'clock, we're going to have a discussion amongst the panelists. What does that mean? It means I'll be taking down, writing some notes, or there may be questions that we didn't get to answer that we can then bring them back. And also you are able to join in that conversation as well. So I'll be prompting Sedina and Sheila to dig deeper into their thoughts and give some considerations around that. And again, as I say, if anyone wants to join in on that, please feel free, or if there are questions that we did not get to, that would be the time when we would actually get to them. So before going any further, and again, you have it in the chat room. I don't know if there's any questions you might have before we get going. Let me stop for a second and see if there are any questions. And after that, we'll get on with the first presentation. Okay, not seeing any. I'm missing something. No, I'm not. I'm going to share now slides. So here we are. Hopefully everybody can see this well. Community engagement in the arts practices. This is today, and how do we consider equity, diversity, inclusion, and so on. Let's go to slideshow from the beginning, and we're off on a journey. I'll send this on. Years ago, a colleague of Sedina, myself, and Sheila, Kevin Ormsby, who's a dance artist, a choreographer, and an activist, a communications expert, etc. We have a relationship with the Center for Policy Alternatives. I'm a research associate there. And Erica Shaker, who now runs the Center for Policy Alternatives, has been a very strong support. So we asked her to write a preface, or at least an introductory quote, that sort of captures the notion. Kevin's report is called Tilling the Field, of developing collaborative practices between IBPOC artists and others. And what Erica talks about is this little question that as a society, we tend to suffer from an overemphasis on the decontextualized present. And, technology is not helping us because access is so quick that we kind of forget what happened yesterday, let alone the history of oppression that we and discrimination that we face. And then she says we spend little time on what came before, either as points on a continuum or in a more cyclical pattern. It's a whitewashed, and she says, pun intended, smoothed out version of reality that gives short shrift to multiplicity of events, voices, and struggles that don't make the hierarchical cut. So again, that word hierarchical, and deliberately conceals from the rest of us those in a position to decide who's in and who's out. And so the notion of transparency is key to inclusion. There's also no question that such amnesia, convenient, deliberate, or unconscious, does us no favors, particularly given how high the stakes are today in North America and elsewhere. We need to become more efficient at moving forward while looking back. Blinkers off, minds open, and privilege checked. So what are the challenges that we're looking at? In a changing environment in the arts, how do artists and organizations constantly develop frameworks for adapting to these changes? The subject is interesting in many contexts because many organizations, structurally or financially, are in varying capacities of development and growth. The potential gray areas we feel offers indicators of potential growth. SAPAMO has emerged as an adaptive organization due to the nature of these changes. In other words, we have to be very nimble all the time in order to develop relationships, supports, allyships, collaborative working relationships, and so on. We have come to understand innately the complexities of the field, such as limited resources available to our artists. And here we're talking about IBPOC artists, Indigenous, Black, people of color predominantly, and other artists who are marginalized through historic episodes of discrimination, many of whom are racialized and Indigenous. So for example, when we do a land acknowledgement, given that we are in Taikaranto, we will always talk about the dish with one spoon, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. And it's a treaty about sharing the resources, right? Sharing the resources. And it was important for us to think about that as an arts organization. How do we learn what that means? And how do we encourage that in the arts community, given the inequities that we see on a daily basis? So what are those? They're historical, bureaucratic underfunding, and the overall underrepresentation of most of our artist associates in larger provincial and national contexts. This is not big news. We've known this for quite some time. The systemic underdevelopment of our artist associates and their organizational capacities. Many are struggling from project to project, or very little operational support, and thus it has an impact upon their creative output and their ability to connect. The years worked in arts in Canada and the United States has offered one major observation, which is a place for repetition in many areas. Collaboration can help to debunk, ground, as well as provide spaces for engagement with and around substantive issues that can liberate traditional models of arts production, creation, engagement, and impact. So we have to begin to think about how do we open our minds to what does it mean to collaborate? What does it mean to really share resources? And in some cases, it can't be 50-50 because if you're coming from a rather well-established organization, the one you may be collaborating with will not have the resources that you might have. May not, and that not just financially, it might also mean in terms of access to space, access to media, access to critics, et cetera, who raise the profile of the arts in our country. I'm continuing on with Kevin's report, and he says here here's a quote that he's used: "The issues we face in our combined roles as artists, researchers, and leaders within institutions compel us to locate our collaborative practice centrally. We recognize that core values must be reconsidered in this new world of rapid idea exchange. The social transformations of modernity have resulted in a world that inhabits new and different audiences and economies. As an education sector, we have yet to assert clearly the value of our current role and potential of our institutions." So that's a question about how we're using our technology to engage and to reach out and to connect. And how do we use that to open people's minds to other areas that can be considered? And you can see the conversation, this one is Sofia, Bulgaria in 2009. So this is a global situation that we're looking at in terms of how do we make collaborations work between the peoples that are seeking them in a way that is also filled with integrity and transparency. Question: if one sees collaboration as a relationship, then it's fair to assert that there are moments when a relationship can be tenuous. Communication is an integral ingredient in solidifying a relationship. Consequently, spontaneity arises as one aims to find a solution to a structure that may not or have not previously worked. So, it's not just a paper agreement. It is a relationship that happens where one can feel free to say, hey, I need to call you and speak to you about this. I'm not totally understanding it. Or, we need to look back at this because things have changed on our end, whatever it might be, so that one is working directly with the individual or the organization one is collaborating with or wants to collaborating with. Relationships take work, and that is a big issue. Many of us are like on to one project or the next, and time becomes a big factor. But relationships take work, and that means time. And it also requires development of a practice, that it's not just, oh, I'll build a relationship. It's no. How do we proceed with relationships as a core value to the work that we are doing, particularly around the subject that we're talking about today? So as previously mentioned, any practice requires knowledge of a structure, but also one needs the acknowledgement that the structure envisioned may need to be reconsidered during the process or may need to change. It is in the practice where the knowledge is gained. So in developing that relationship, you have a way of operating, and the person or the group that you want to connect with probably does as well. What time do you take to make that happen? So for example, if one is in rehearsal, it's a question of, do you just march ahead 3 hours in rehearsal room and this is what you have to do? Or do you say, whoa, let's take a break and talk about it, to make sure everybody's on the same page, or they're understanding, particularly if the characters in the work one is doing are from diverse backgrounds, Indigenous, Black, people of color, other historically marginalized artists, how to make sure that those perspectives are key in the decision-making around any work that's done, and how to develop the relationships so that people feel comfortable in that. We've seen a couple of explosions in the past year where that has not happened. Some of it in the media. So we want to make sure that people moving forward understand it takes time, and it's important to build in the time, not to say, well, we can't do it because it's going to take too much time. Figure it out as part of the process, I guess is the question. So Dr. Michelle Rosen suggests there are 4 ways in which you can create an environment centered on the open two-way communication that builds cohesion. And these include transparency, being open, practice being open, having transparent communication. It's a good idea to share information throughout your organization. Make sure everybody knows, not just the one leading, but that everybody knows, as it creates an environment of trust and a feeling of being in it together. Many arts organizations are really beginning to understand it's not just the artistic director's idea, but it's the company's idea. And how can that be shared across the company so that everyone says, okay. Collaboration. Many failures stem from lack of collaboration and poor communication. This secretive us versus them mentality divides people and can lead to friction. Leaders should identify this as soon as possible and immediately put into place practices that strengthen relationships, forging a strong culture of open feedback and communication. Bringing people together in this way really does work. Always look for ways to build connections between people. And again, this is going to take time in order to be able to do that. So that's going to be a big factor. Organizational collaboration, marrying the artistic collaborators. So it's not just if it's a dance or a theater, hey, let's invite you in to do this the Eurocentric way. It's, oh, we're inviting in persons of African descent or indigenous background or Latinx background, et cetera. They may have a different interpretation of this piece. How do we open the door to that? How do we open the door to that? And how do we make sure that whatever comes out, so this is talking about transforming the arts practice that brings in perspectives that were excluded. And it's making sure everyone in the organization is working together as part of the collaboration. We're now finishing a piece of work for CanStage and Luminato on onboarding. How do you bring on new artistic directors or new actors or new, people coming with a project and have their own company? Say, hey, you're working in our space. How do we work together around this? Be particular about how you are already collaborating and also allow yourself to think how micro your collaborations can become. The potential inclusion of everyone you work with can be a major benefit in the overall outcome. Clarity is always needed in the artistic collaboration to figure out how we collaborate. Finding, arriving, and nurturing the relationship of the collaboration are the truest spirit that can encapsulate collaboration. It will enhance the feeling of abundance and should be also capitalized over the time of first and other collaborative endeavors. When you're bringing two together, you have more resources to work with. Even if the organization you may be collaborating with, or the artist may have less than you suddenly have more than you started with. And I have to say, the collaborators need to work together. So all the resources belong to the collaboration, no matter where they come from. Collaboration should include community from concept, execution, and implementation. In the changing environments of the arts, the aforementioned begs collaborators to think about the areas of their artistic practice. How can one maximize the essence and appreciation of the collaboration across varying levels of engagement? In true cross-sector collaboration, no single actor or agency monopolizes the power to set goals, shape agendas, and determine key policies and practices. That's probably one of the most difficult things, is to say, okay, I want to collaborate, but I can't make decisions anymore. I have to do it together. And in order for it to be true and to really engage as much as possible. The benefit is, if everyone is collaborating well, then what happens is those people become very much engaged in the process and become leaders in the process as well. In those collaborations supported by presenters, they should start with a discussion, and some of the information in section 3 of the report. We will send you the report as well as the slides. Will help to facilitate the ways in which artists and arts organizations can broker meaningful and viable ways to formal presentations. Always create the processes together, allowing for multi-layered areas of engagement and interaction. For example, is your organization familiar with or have worked in community-based arts practice? Are you aware of the organizations offering training in this area? Have you worked in the past with indigenous artists, artists of color, artists who are disabled, and so on? What have you learned from that? Number 3, we're still going back to this wonderful doctor's quotes. Clarity regarding roles and rules. Those who have clear roles, responsibilities, and deadlines are more likely to be held accountable, and they are more likely to hold themselves accountable. That is critical, especially in a collaboration. Working with another group, organization, artist, what are the timelines? Who's doing what? How is the work being responsibly shared? And so on. And then we talked about already diversity, awareness in all communications. We're working across cultures, working across race, working across issues of self-identification, whether indigeneity, whether in terms of the LGBTQ2+, whether as immigrants, etc. I mean, we're in Canada. Canada's got a very large, diverse population. It's only going to get more so. So how do we look at cross-cultural communication strategically for a company who's working with a diverse workforce, or how it entails global operations become really quite important. And then finally, issues around decision-making. Who made the decision? How was it communicated? Did you invite others to assist in decision-making? How many aspects were considered in the process arriving at the decision? These are always important every time to raise, okay, how did we get here? Where are we going? What have we learned from the past? How do we connect to make sure that we're moving together smooth? Yes, there will be some moments where there'll be bumps. That happens in a creative process naturally. But then what is the process by which we use our knowledge and our skills, our listening in particular, to hear from each other and to basically look at working in new ways? Some others around implementation. In what ways will the collaboration be implemented? What are the roles of the collaborators? Are these roles clearly communicated and documented? When do you assess efficacy of the implementation? How do you create timelines to implement collaboratively? Again, these are just questions to consider as we're going forward, because it's all, and these are not just one time, they're all the time. These are everyday questions. And then finally, on execution, how do we arrive at the process? When and in what ways are deliverables required? Is there a critical path for which participants are aware? And who executes follow-ups? How do you know that the collaboration has worked, both with the organization, individuals you've collaborated with, as well as on those who have seen or have some insight into the collaborative process in and of itself? That's it for me. Thanks for listening. And again, we will share these slides with you, as well as the article that I refer to there of Kevin Ormsby. It's a rather lengthy text, but it has a lot of examples in it that can be used to develop collaborative agreements, thought processes around how to think of collaborations, etc. So I'm open to questions or comments before we move on. No questions? Yeah, I've never been that clear. Okay, let's move on then to Sedina. Questions may come up and we'll deal with, there is one hand now is raised from an attendee. One hand was raised. I think we're okay. Yeah, so let's go on to Sedina, and we'll proceed the same way.
Thank you, Charles. It was really great. I hope some questions or anything arises from the things you shared, which is such a great framework. I'm going to just talk about what I want to call social justice 101. I'm very aware that many of you on this call will be familiar with these contexts, but I think it's good for us to just get on the same page as to what we're even talking about. And when we talk about those, which is becoming a handy acronym of EDI or EDIB, as this whole seminar has been called: equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging. Sometimes people also add justice to that. So yes, I'll share some slides, but just because it's just helpful, because there's some things that we should break down. Okay. Here we go. Social justice 101. Let me go back. Okay. So overall, when we're talking about social justice, and I'm really going to break down as well systemic oppression, is we're talking first and foremost about systems. And I think this is really important because I think there's been a lot of what we call identity politics in the last, few years. And what that means is that people are, talking about their particular identities and how they're specifically oppressed, which is important, as well as how that's played out on an individual level. And that's also important. But we can get into the weeds really easily when we forget the overall systems that we're operating within and what we're actually trying to dismantle here. How the overall systems leads to the individual behavior that manifests itself in ways that cause suffering. So overall, when we're talking about social justice, is that we're talking about social systems. So how our society is organized. So government, economic, education, family. These are the sort of systems, at least as the theory goes, of how we all live together and how we're in relationship to each other. These systems have a major role to play in that. So we also talk about, for social justice, social constructs, which is a really important, super important terminology, and for me, a super important thing to understand. There's not necessarily scientific basis for categorizing individuals and group identities. So specifically, we're talking about things that might be influenced by birth and genetics. They may not be, but we're talking about race, class, gender, and ability. So these are all social constructs, and it's so important, especially when we're talking about race and gender, and to a certain extent, ability, and class certainly, is that we as a society, we have created what these are. Not necessarily us individually, but we were born into a world where these categorizations existed. And as time goes on, they evolve and they change. Their original origin, well, that's when we're talking about white supremacy, et cetera, about who created them to begin with as ways of categorizing them ourselves. But for now, we're stuck with them. And this is what we have. We come out of the womb, we are into these groups. And as we all know, they change over time. And they also change from place to place. So it's very contextual. So what race means in North America is different than, say, what race might mean in Australia, actually, or what it might mean in India, or what it might mean in any number of places. It actually, it means different things based on where you are and who is around you and the context and the history of that particular place as to how people are categorized. There's some commonalities around the world, certainly, but we really have to remember that, because sometimes what comes up with in these workshops is like, well, in X place, this means that. And that's fair. In X place, maybe this particular group of people are considered oppressed and for various reasons, but that may not necessarily be true, for instance, in Canada, or so-called Canada, where we are. So another concept that's important to social justice is around power. So who is in the top decision-making positions when we're talking about government, education, economics, family, who holds the power, who makes the decision, who has the most amount of resources in terms of money, houses, etc. Who makes the policies and creates frameworks that affect more than themselves. So although we all hopefully, thankfully, have some power over our individual lives, we're not always in a position where what we decide to do affects a lot of other people in terms of a rule or guidelines or laws that we create, that we don't have the power to do that. We don't do that. So when we're talking about power, we're asking that question of who holds the power within the societal institutions that I talked about, as well as who holds power across race, class, and ability. Charles and I also do the door jurors education. And so we often do that exercise called the power flower, which I'm sure some people on this call are familiar with, where we look at various, systems in society and we say, okay, who is the dominant group that holds the power? Across race, in our society right now, we can say definitely white people hold the majority of power. Across gender and sexuality, we would say that straight people hold the most amount of power, as well as those who are cisgendered. Across class, we'll say, of course, those who have the most money, who are in the upper classes, and even to a certain extent, middle classes, hold the most amount of power in terms of deciding. And then across ability, we say those who can walk, those who can see, those who can hear, those who can participate in society in a very, like, society is set up for them. You know what I mean? You don't, in terms of how we think, those who think in a non-neurodivergent way, not like me, and probably not like a lot of people because we're artists. So these are, when we look at the profile, those are the people who hold the power. So those are the people who we're saying, who get to make the decisions and who are often in decision-making capacities and who have historically made decisions that affect us all today. So in terms of social justice, what we're trying to do with this, it's a series of frameworks, ideas, strategies, and the goal is to end suffering and create a more harmonious world for everyone. Because what we're saying is that who holds the power right now means that the rest of us and even the natural world are and have continued to suffer. And so how do we end that suffering? Well, a lot of people have different ideas around that. Various social justice activists and thinkers, philosophers, artists like ourselves come up with ways to have a more just society where we don't have one dominant group holding the power, but maybe everybody has more of a say over how we're able to live our lives and how resources are distributed. So it shifts as society shifts, which is a really important thing to say. Like the things that we're sharing now, in 5 years, we could have the same workshop and we would share something slightly different because things have changed. It's because we change, we learn more, we grow, thankfully, and hopefully we have different conversations. The conversations we were having 5 to 10 years ago are not the same conversations that we're having now. And that can be a frustrating concept for some folks because they're like, oh my goodness, so-and-so's calling themselves what now? And you're like, yes, so-and-so is calling themselves this now because things have changed. We are humans. We're mutable. We can change. You know what I mean? And things are going to change. So there's no such thing as a social justice Bible, or a social justice book that's going to tell you everything all the time. I think what the most important thing is just to have a really open mind and to just keep listening and learning, knowing that things are going to shift. So when we're talking about oppression, we're talking about who does not hold power and who experiences suffering as a result, and how those systems that we talked about actively work to ensure that those who have power continue to have power and vice versa. So we talk about oppression based on race. So we're talking about racism, generally just systemic discrimination based on race. So systemic discrimination and oppression means that the systems in place have various laws, policies, frameworks, ways of being that actively say, for instance, Black people are not worthy of leadership. Black people cannot participate in particular ways. Black people, in the case of, for instance, the justice system, Black people are overrepresented in Canada in the justice system. Indigenous people are overrepresented because we're more likely to, when we do commit any sort of crime, we are more likely to be penalized for it, and as well as various reasons how we even got to that space to begin with. But yes, so we're talking about oppression based on classism, which is something we talk about a lot in equity, actually, Canadian Actors Equity, is that, I just saw recently that we changed the bylaws, for instance, around just greater transparency around dues remission, which is a great thing to address the fact that not like a lot of us are on precarious incomes, and that a lot of us, are not holding a lot of class privilege. So that's what we're just talking about there, is literally class privilege. So I think what's really important to talk about as artists, as well as artists and arts workers, is that think about as well the class that you were raised in, because a lot of us, not all, but some people have really been raised in either middle class or upper middle class upbringings, but then they find themselves as artists or arts workers being actually maybe more working class, because that's a choice that they've made, because to pursue this particular as we know, is to pursue this vocation means that we're not necessarily going to be paid as much. So, but the fact that you came from an upper middle class or a middle class background, it influences how you were even able to enter into the arts or become an arts worker. So as much as, yes, you may not have, the big bank account now, the fact is that you came from a background that did. And so that really can influence where you are now. And think of the folks who didn't come from those backgrounds and how much they're able to participate in our industries. So oppression based on ability. So we're talking about ableism. So that's just the frameworks that, says everybody can walk, talk, hear, see the same way, that everybody thinks the same way, that people don't apparently have mental health issues, not a thing. All of those things basically saying that we are productive citizens and that, we can interact in the world in a way that the dominant systems tell us to. Autism, which you may not know what that means, but that's really about a framework that centers hearing people. Hence, it's so great that we have ASL interpreters on this call. But autism basically is a world that centers the fact that you can hear. So, for instance, like I was talking to a deaf friend of mine about being in Toronto and being on public transit. And sometimes, we'll have these things where the train will just stop because of whatever reason, and we have to like stop at St. Andrew Station. And I always wonder about how deaf people are able to even know what's going on, because oftentimes it's just an announcement over the it's just an announcement. So there's nothing written. So if you can't hear and you interact with the world through sign language, maybe you wouldn't necessarily know what's going on. You just see a mass exodus of people leaving the train. And it's a real default on the part of the TTC that they haven't really addressed this issue of being able to, assuming that everybody can hear, and how to transmit information to those who can't. Ageism. Okay, y'all. Everybody loves to talk about this one in the arts, right? It's a big one. It's certainly intersects with sexism in terms of women, where like we get older, we have less opportunities, and something I've been hearing and have seen and experienced. It is an ability-based oppression. Why? Because as you get older, some people are not able to physically do things in the same way they were, or even the perception that they are not able to do things the way they were, or the perception that they basically just aren't able. They aren't, what they have to offer isn't as important, etc. That falls under, it actually is an ability-based oppression. And it's an important one, and it does happen within big time within our industry, and it's something that we need to continue to address. But I personally, Sedina puts this under the category of oppression based on ability. Fat phobia. Now, this is a huge one in our industry as well, when we're talking about who is considered a larger body and how they're perceived. Again, it's an oppression based on ability, because we're saying, because you are in a larger body, you can't do certain things. You are not deemed as attractive. You are deemed as unhealthy, because you are deemed to not be able to participate in society in a way that's the square way that we're talking about, being able to walk, talk, etc. And it's, even if it's just the perception, which it often is just the perception and not reality, it still is an oppression based on perceived ability. Okay, so it's oppression based on gender and sexuality. Oops, I meant to say homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and there's more. But so gender and sexuality, again, just really driving home that gender is a social construct, i.e., we as a society have decided what gender is. As many of us on this call will understand, or if you don't, you can, of course, go down that hole, is that gender, I think for so long we've all believed, of course, that the gender that you've been assigned at birth, i.e. male or female, woman or man, girl or boy, is who you are. And as we know with various people, it actually is a lot more complicated than that. Even within the categories of boy, girl, woman, man, I see that there are many ways to express that, and each person decides how they want to express that. You make the decision based on how you relate to whatever society's told you about who these people are, who these groups are, and you make the decision onto how you dress, what types of activities you do, etc. You make those decisions based on what your spirit tells you want to do, or maybe based on the fact that you feel like, okay, I have to adhere to these specific things. This is what I've been told women do. This is what I've been told men do. but it's a social construct. It doesn't, the connection between biology and what has been assigned at birth is nebulous at best. um, it's That's all it is. It's just biology. It is something that we are changing. And in fact, what it means to be a woman now is very different in our society than what it meant to be a woman, say 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, right? So it's something that it is constantly evolving. And I think it's just important to remember that. Um, so gender and sexuality are connected in a big way, because when we're talking about sexuality, we're just talking about how people are, who they're attracted to. So the gender they are and the gender of the people that they're attracted to. That's sexuality in a sense. I mean, the young folks these days, as you know, are even breaking down sexuality in terms of both talking about who you're romantically attracted to, i.e. who you want to go on dates and have fun with, and who you're sexually attracted to, who you actually want to have sex with. They're like people who are like, I'm biromantic, asexual, etc. These are all kinds of words that I'm hearing and understanding as people further define and say, okay, this is how I relate to romance. This is how I relate to sex. This is how I want to be in the world based on what my spirit tells me I want to be. These phobias, as we say, are all about saying, okay, that's the way you are in the world, and that is wrong. And in fact, you need to be straight. You know what I mean? You need to be, a cisgendered person, i.e. somebody whose gender aligns with the gender that they were assigned to at birth. Okay, and just the last one, oppression based on religion. So I'm sure many of us have an understanding, which we've seen lately, a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism. So that's, oppression based on somebody's religion. In this case, anti-Semitism, we're talking about those who are Jewish, and for Islamophobia, which has been on the rise since forever, is and continues, is again, oppression based on someone's religion if they are identify as Muslim. So intersectionality. So this is the interconnected nature of social categorization such as race, class, gender, I would add ability, as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as overlapping and independent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So, I mean, we never want to play what I'm sure you all have heard, the oppression Olympics, of being like, oh, who's more oppressed than somebody else? And it's not really about that. What this framework tries to teach us is about the fact that if you are a member, like saying that we already talked about who the dominant groups are in society, the further you are from those dominant groups is basically the more oppression that you face. So it's just going to be hard to fit in with any particular group, where you're basically saying, as a Black woman, as an example, as a Black queer woman, I can experience oppression even as I'm a part of various different groups. So as a Black person, I can definitely still, within the Black communities, plural, like still experience oppression as a woman. I can still experience oppression as a queer person from other Black people, for example. So it really is just talking about that, because really nobody wins at the oppression Olympics. It's like, what's the prize? More suffering? Like, what is that? That's not a thing. So what we're actually just trying to say with this framework is that you can be members of multiple groups that are experiencing suffering and experiencing, systemic disadvantage. And so it's important within that, and in the queer community, especially, as Ryan can attest to, both of us having been involved for a while, Black people in queer communities, we really do have to push forward and fight for our spaces, for our rights. Indigenous people and Two-Spirit people the same, because although, yes, we are all queer, we might say we're all this or that in terms of the LGBTQ to I2S community. There are those of us who are experiencing something even more acute and something frankly even different, because it means something a little bit different to be Black and queer as opposed to just queer. Or as opposed to being white and queer, as opposed to being, Palestinian and queer. It colors my experience in a different way. Even though there's many spaces that we can find overlap, it's important to understand the differences and understand how it just makes life harder, frankly. Okay, so and a framework that I think people might find useful, and I'll stop. Oh my gosh, I should have been wearing my watch. I'm so much better when I'm facilitating. I should have been wearing my watch to just be like, where are we at for time? But Charles, just let me know where we're at, and if I'm going too long, because frankly, just so full transparency, I have ADHD and I can just keep talking.
You're good,
So
Sedina. Keep going.
great, thank you. Okay, so in terms of a useful framework that I'm finding in my work, doing this analysis work of like, where do we go from here? What are we doing? Like, we know a lot of us on this call already, like the stuff I talked about, you're already well aware of. And in fact, already in the spaces of being able to dismantle, being able to change. And you're like, what do we do with this information? Um, and in fact, I'm sure it always comes up on every call. All y'all are going to have this thing. Well, this thing happened when I did this gig in this town, and we didn't know what to do. I hear it all the time. It always comes up, and like, sure, bring up your examples of things that you're like, this didn't go the way I wanted it to go. I was, all the things. So I offer this as a framework to help a little bit, hopefully understand where we're going in the industry, because it can be confusing. So I think there's three buckets I can kind of think of things as, and representation. So that's just talking about who is doing the work, right? So who's doing the work? Who's holding the power? Who has positions of leadership within our industry? Who are the artistic directors, the directors, the producers? When we're talking about organizations, who's executive directors, things like that. Is a big thing that we've been talking about for a long time. We've talked about it certainly within thinking of Nightwood and going back to the Nightwood history and thinking back to like the 80s, which I hope this will delight some of the folks on this call who lived through that time. But like thinking back to like Rena Fraticelli's report back in the 80s and the subsequent reports then looking at the representation of women within theater and saying, okay, who are directors, who are playwrights, who are artistic directors? And thankfully we've moved forward on that. So that type of thing is looking at who is leading, who's doing the work, the numbers of people, like Equity, they did the census a while back. Again, looking just numbers, we want to look at that. The problem with this bucket, though, is that in terms of when we're talking about white feminism, which isn't real feminism, but still it's a name, I think there was just this laser-like focus on representation of women. So to say, if we have more women in leadership roles, things will be better. And for me, that doesn't tell the whole story, because it doesn't matter as much to me as we've seen. There's been some women in leadership roles. Margaret Thatcher. Do you know what I mean? Like that didn't actually shift anything. And in fact, if she's still a person who, as an example, as a leader, who is still embracing terrible policies, does it really matter that she's a woman? I'm sure some of you even worked with various people from various representative groups. Unfortunately, I hate to bring this up, who didn't necessarily embrace the values that you wanted them to embrace. It wasn't enough that they were Black or Indigenous. It wasn't enough that they were a woman or that they were disabled, et cetera. Like it doesn't, just because they're there doesn't actually, it can shift things, but it doesn't necessarily. But still an important piece to look at. So content. So this is another thing that comes up a lot in our work too. It's just like, okay, which stories are being told and from which point of view? So yes, plain and simple, are we prioritizing the stories of people who have been historically erased, the people who've historically been oppressed, as we talked about? What are the stories that we're telling, or whatever we're putting on the stage? It's like, what is it about? What's the content about? And that's another area in and of itself that we can spend some time on. Process. Okay, so this is the biggest space where I feel, especially those of us who are members of Canadian Actors Equity, this is the biggest and the most difficult space, and the ones where we're really coming across a lot of issues as we figure it out. It's just like how we work together, our processes for creating and working together. It's like when we get into those creative spaces that we all want to be in, or we interact with the various engagers it's just like, how do we work together? And so saying that, going back to our systemic oppression, talking about our systems, the systems that we have inherited inform how we work together. So this is why this is the hardest piece, because we've all on some level internalized certain white supremacist ways of working. We've internalized those. We can't help it. And in fact, our whole industry has been built upon those ideas. But I think there's been a lot of movement now to really address them. and to say, why are we working together in this way? Who is benefiting from that? And who loses? And so and process actually is the big space where Canadian Actors Equity, that's why we exist, is because a while ago, thinking of American Actors Equity, like, in the early 20th century, a group of performers came together and said, we are not being treated fairly. Our process isn't right. We need to come together, hence unions exist, and say, this is how we want to be treated. It can be the hardest space. And it's the space actually where most of us have the most power to do anything, because oftentimes we're not necessarily in a position to look at content. Like if you're directing a piece, you're like, I've chosen to direct this piece. I don't know, like I've chosen for various reasons, probably for what it's about, but I don't control what it's about. Directors, again, another space, and producers certainly have a space where, yeah, they can look at the representation. They can be like, who's here? I would say like folks like performers and stage managers, fight directors as well. Like you don't have as much say in that, even though you can, and many of you, I'm sure, do advocate for increased representation. Like if you go into a room and you feel like, or you see a process and you're just like, I noticed this is for instance, an all-white process, like what's going on here? You might say something, but it isn't ultimately your decision to make, but you can still advocate. But the process piece is something that you do have power over, in the sense that a big thing that I've learned in my work that I'll share with all of you is that, and I'll keep repeating this over and over again, by the time you get to rehearsal, it is too late to make a bunch of changes. The train has already left the track. You can definitely do what social, a lot of social workers might call harm reduction, i.e. you can reduce the harm that could happen, that might happen, that is going to happen, that did happen. But being in a space of harm reduction is not the most powerful space to be in. So what you can do, I feel like, to address these things is you need to ask yourselves some real key questions about your values, about what kind of work you want to create, who you're creating it with, and ask the people who are asking you to join those rooms and join those processes the questions that will let you know that this is representative of the values. This is representative of dismantling systemic oppression, and in its place, putting in something better. And no one's asking for perfection, but questions need to at least be asked. If they are not asked, you put yourself in a position where you don't know what's going to happen. And then that's when you're like, okay, I'm calling the Haven helpline, legit. I'm calling equity. I'm calling so-and-so. What do we do now? Because, conflicts arose, this arose. So saying sometimes you take the gig anyway, no, it's going to be a hot mess, but that's your choice. And know that it's always your choice to do that. If you are in a position to be creating a room, i.e. as the director, then yeah, you got to really think about how you're going to work together, which is a big thing that directors do anyway. It's just what they do. But it's, how are you going to inform the process of how we're creating this work together through principles that are really aligning with your values that are trying to dismantle, systemic racism, systemic oppression. So yeah, I'll stop sharing there. And we'll just leave it open for questions for a bit, as we said we would do.
So folks have any questions of Sedina? And again, we will share the slides. I've already put the slides from my presentation as well as Kevin's report into the chat room, so you can have access to that. Two ways of, as was mentioned at the outset, either raise hand or write something in the Q&A, and we'll go from there. Quiet Monday. Heidi.
Can you hear me if I
Yes.
talk like this?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I suppose my question is kind of a big and general one, but how do you deal with getting things wrong? Like, I feel like there's so much that we all have to do to get things right when it comes to social justice and dismantling systems of oppression. But in the process of doing that, I mean, we are going to make mistakes and we are going to get things wrong and we are going to inadvertently perhaps hurt people. And how do you have any advice on how to deal with making those mistakes, making up for them, and moving on? Because it's kind of daunting to try and take it all on and be right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Sedina, do you want to continue answering on that?
Sure. And I'd love to hear what you have to say, Charles. Always
Yeah.
interested. And Sheila as well, like
Yes.
just, on the ground. Okay, so firstly, we're all gonna get it wrong some of the time. That's part of it. It's life. We're just humans. I think what's really important though is having a framework to address conflict and issues as they arise. Just to say, for instance, not in our space, as the program tries to do that, because you have this opening statement on the first day that it says we don't condone harassment in the space. And then it talks about where do you go to, when things do happen, where to go. So there's that. There's been some work that I've been doing with Stratford, for better or worse. It's work in progress around creating room agreements. And I've done this work for a while anyway. It's pretty common. A lot of facilitators, like social justice facilitators, like we just do that. And so in the room or community agreement, you can talk about what to do when conflict arises. Some options maybe, do you have a mediator? Do you have a session? Do we talk it out? In the end, I think what's really important is from a transformative justice framework. It's funny because transformative justice is such a big word that makes it, it makes it sound so daunting, like it's like all of these things. But I think for me, what it comes down to is listening and getting to the root of the issues. Because that's really what people want. They really want to get to the root of what's happening here. And so those of us who are leaders in a space have to be really smart about that. We listen to what's happening and we're like, what is at the root of this that needs to change? And maybe we can't change it all, but maybe we can make some change that will help. For instance, give a personalish example, like I'm often a person who's late for things, y'all. I'm not going to lie. I just am. And anyone who's on equity council with me knows I'm late. Like I just am. And the thing that would help me the most is I don't necessarily even need more time. It's not even about that. But maybe we look at the expectation that everybody needs to be on time. Or maybe we come up with something around that so that like those who who you are, the Capricorns and Virgos of the world who are like always on time for things. And in fact, not even on time, you're early, you're 15 minutes early and waiting for folks like me to show up. And so like, how do we adjust expectations as an example? You know what I mean? Around that being saying, this is how we're going to work together so that both the people who tend to be late have a space and those who are diligent early on time, you know what I mean? Have a space too, as opposed to being like, okay, this person's going to apologize profusely for something, they're not going to change. They're, we're going to keep coming up with this issue. It's just like, let's maybe just adjust something fundamentally that will help everybody get along better in the space and that honors what's going on here. So that we're really getting to it. And when you're able to speak to that and at least do something to push that forward, people will feel better. I genuinely actually believe that folks have a lot of empathy when they see you're actually trying. When you do not try or you brush things under the rug, that is really what angers people. When you really don't address, like listen and address the issues and take the steps necessary, is really what gets people, you know, it gets people, really upset. A great example that comes up, it's going to come up a lot, y'all. I know it's come up for many of you in the call. I'll say this real quick because I've spoken a lot, is pronouns. Oh, this pronouns help us all. Older people, some of them, it's just very difficult for them, I think, to ever use a pronoun they, them, or the other types of pronouns that exist, she, her, etc. Like, it may be very difficult for them to remove a framework of looking at someone and deciding upon their gender based on how they look and just ascribing that to them. So as an example, what might address that is probably having a really good talk with folks and just being like, let's all keep trying to do better with this. And let's work with the folks who are really triggered by this and really work with them to understand where other people are coming from, and work with the other folks who can't get it right to continue to get it right, and say that this is a work in progress and this is how we're going to work on this, instead of just writing off any group and saying, okay, well, they just can't do it, or you're just going to have to do it, because it's not going to happen. So getting to getting closer to the root of the issue, and at least even trying to, I think, is really what will help a situation. And I'm not going to guarantee that things will be solved, but it at least will help push it forward a bit. End of thoughts.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think for me, the first question is, how does the relationship begin? What is the first conversation? And how do you enter into that conversation? So I'm an artistic director of a company. And before I work with anyone, we say, hey, can we go out? Or, today it's Zoom world, pre-COVID, it was, can we meet for a coffee or a tea or whatever, someplace comfortable, so we can begin to have a conversation. Hi, how are you? That kind of stuff. Glad we can meet, and then have an open one. And spend, like I said earlier, time is the critical factor. We've got to struggle against time, because time means we've got to do this, got to do it now. We only have so much time to get it. And that, if I can call it railroading, because that's kind of what it is, it's railroading the process toward an outcome. So forget the outcome, focus on the process. And the process is about the relationship and how to build it. And that means sincerity enters the room, integrity, right? And so, yes, mistakes will come up. I always go by the Thelonious Monk, jazz musician. His notion is, the mistake is what's happened. And he says in jazz, it's the note you play, and it's what do you do with the note you play after. So if a mistake is made, it's, what is wrong with, a sincere apology. I didn't know. This happens a lot with microaggressions. Oh, wow, I didn't know. And we don't know because we don't share same space. Right? We don't. We still live in, it was interesting. I was at an event on Saturday, an after party, and I saw the whites in one group, the Latinxes in another group, the blacks in another, and they all know each other very well. So, the conversations in each of those groups will be very different. The question is what happens when they come together, and how do we break down those isolations? So time is becoming a really critical factor in how to do that. There are 5 questions in the chat room. I'll invite Sheila and Sedina to look at it. I'll start off with the first one. What kind of training do you think is needed to train directors and others in power to work effectively in the room with all the different groups you've outlined? I put in the chat room, and someone's asking about the first essentials in the first conversation. I put in the chat room Sapamo's website. We're hosting a session called Gathering Divergence. Actually, Sedina is going to be on a panel with us involving CanStage and Luminato, who some of you may know had a couple of eruptions last year in inappropriate onboarding. So Anita La Selva, who I'm sure many of you may be familiar with, and I worked on this report. And it was looking at we don't use the term best practice. We want to see evidence-based practice. What have people done? How has it been assessed or evaluated? What was the learning? And how can that then be transported somewhere else? We've laid out a number of important steps, I think, in terms of onboarding. And it goes back to what I was saying originally. How do you start the conversation? One of you have a question in the room, about what does it mean to start the conversation? If you're interested, then you have to initiate it, right? Number one. But you initiate it with no more than, I'd like to have a conversation with you. There's something I'm thinking about. You might be interested. I certainly, from what I know about you, I'm interested in having this conversation with you. And then just have a genuine conversation where you can disclose what it is you feel you don't know. And if it comes to training, it really is important in an arts organization that all people in the organization are on the same team when it comes to working with, let's say new companies, new artists, etc., and are available to and actually meet, again, the question of developing relationships. Sedina, Sheila, jump in. I'm not sure what is meant by cancel culture. I've heard it used in a couple of variety of ways, the right wing using it to say that it's a new term for political correctness, is what I say. So I don't know if that cancel culture really, and I may not be answering the person's question. When I heard the term cancel culture come up, though, from people like Ivanka Trump, they're talking about silencing our voices because we are calling them out. So we're not saying cancel anything. We're saying we need to have our rightful place in what is happening, and you're denying it. And so then for us calling you out, you're suggesting that we're telling you can't talk anymore. That is farthest from the truth, furthest from the truth. Engagers, the same thing. We have to be able to spend more time in implementing better practices. It means we have to relearn. I mean, all the things that Sedina has raised about, the various identities that can come into the room are, they have different cultures, different ways of understanding the universe, different ways of working in rehearsal spaces. And so rather than, and we had this conversation about a year ago with Peggy Baker Dance, you bring all these people into the room about Simone de Beauvoir, her body is words, but the people you've brought in are not white feminists. They're non-binary individuals, they're two-spirited indigenous individuals, they're people who are questioning their orientation and see themselves as women in very different ways than a white feminist approach. How do you open up to that as opposed to, this is my idea, this is how I want it done? As Sedina was pointing out earlier, and we're having this conversation in the world of equity, where I basically am this day saying, looking at the Prime Minister of England, now a South Asian guy, Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, we've talked about, the new expression, skin folk are not necessarily kinfolk. There's a critical perspective, in my view. Kevin Wormsby, my colleague, often says the term Black conservative in our worldview is an oxymoron. Right? How could you be part of the institution that enslaved us and continues to degrade us? But there they are. Anyway, so engages, again thing, more time to implement. You have to just, if it's a 2-week rehearsal period, why? Who said that? There's X number of rehearsal hours. I understand that. And the question is, how do you use it to build the relationships? I don't know, I've talked a bit, Sheila, and said, and I don't know if you folks wanted to come in on any of those questions.
I think you both have done a brilliant job at addressing those questions. I guess the only piece that the thing I'm picking up on in a number of those questions is fear. And in the work that I do around that, I think I was going to get into it a little later today, but I'm happy. Charles, you can give me an indication of whether you think now is a good time. The work that I've done do with groups around white fragility, fear is a very common thing that comes up around race and racism and social change and dealing with having content raised in your environment that that you may have omitted or done something that has reproduced racism. You may have been the person that's carried out a microaggression, or there may be just many more Indigenous, Black, and people of color in the room than you're used to, and that frightens you because it's and it's often very unconscious because we're just generally as white people used to being in white dominated historically used to be in white dominated groups. So I think when I talk to people about I won't go into it in great detail right now what white fragility is and how it plays out, and I think of them as activities, the activities of white fragility. One of the biggest ones I say is silence. The silence of white people around systemic racism, around anti-Blackness, around anti-Indigenous racism is one of the worst activities that carry out in terms of having systemic racism and colonialism endure. And silence, I think, has a lot to do with fear. So even when we're progressive folks, and participating in social justice activities, or wish to be contributing in a way that's consistent with social justice, then we can still find ourselves being silent because we're so afraid of not getting it all right that we actually get it wrong by not saying anything or not doing anything. So it's really about risk taking. So a lot of what we have heard most recently, just Sedina's analysis and sharing of the systemic reality of what you're all facing in the work that you all do requires many of us to be taking risks to make the change we need to make. So I guess that's what I would contribute right now.
Thanks, Sheila. There are a couple of questions in the chat room.
Oh, so many questions. There was like
Yep,
no questions in all the
wonderful.
questions. Okay.
All came up.
Yes.
So one is around, it seems people who are currently doing good get nailed for past bad behaviors and then they are dismissed or canceled. Some are deservedly canceled, but others who are contrite and have made change are put in the same basket. Does this question make sense? Yes, it does. To me, it takes time. So one thing, when trust is damaged, it takes time to repair. It's not going to happen overnight. A simple apology is probably not going to do it. Because you have to remember, if trust is developed in any relationship and then it's broken, we know there's a repair job that needs to be done. The question then is, how does one take responsibility for their behavior? And how does one think thoughtfully, carefully, even consulting with others? What can I do here? I've spoken to a number of people in the past year around broken relationships, and to say, and sometimes you just have to let it go. Person, no, I've moved on. I'm not interested in going back there. Just let it go and learn from it in the next one. So that's really critical. But again, it's like how we learn from whatever the error or the mistake has been, and how that helps us in our practice going forward. And ideally, if possible, making a return to whoever, the person, organization where the mistake has been made, and to really say, hey, I'd like to maybe have a conversation to review this. Not asking you to have to contribute, but I do think I need to let you know what I've gotten out of this, learned from, and how I hope to be able to behave in the future. Some of the difficulties around this, for example, are sadly in the arts ecology, we have not done much around some powerful individuals who have made giant mistakes around cultural appropriation, for example, and still getting tons of money and acting. So that becomes kind of a problem, because it does say, no big deal, no big deal. And it really is a big deal. So we all have to take those things. We shouldn't have to wait for an arts council to say your funding's at risk. We should be able to, I think of Shakespeare in Action, for example. I think of Robert de Rosier with Kanata and Slav. We can go on with the examples, right? And the challenge is when individuals in those positions do not take responsibility for what they've done, and the harm that causes.
Yeah, I
yeah.
agree with that, Charles.
Go right ahead.
Thanks so much. The question I have around folks who have committed harm that's been labeled as damaging and harmful, what was done to address it? Was anything done? Did they address it? And I just want to say that what I've seen from transformative justice, what I'm like experiencing in my body around it, y'all, it's a long ass process. Like if you think that someone can just make an apology tomorrow and everything's going to be okay, it won't be. And that's difficult in the context of doing like a 2-3 week rehearsal process, but for some people who have done some serious harm, I think that hasn't been addressed. It's going to be a long time. It's going to be years, I think, before people trust them again. And this isn't about cancel culture. The only thing, so it's just as a long thing. It's the long thing, and don't expect answers tomorrow, and don't expect people to feel like, oh, that person overnight or in a week or two is actually sorry. I'm like, are they sorry? Do they actually know what they did? And have they taken some real steps toward reparation, tangible, like visible steps? Because then I think people would feel better if we actually saw that. But do we ever see that? Or do we just kick people out because it's easier to do that? Another thing I'll say is around cancel culture. I don't believe in it as a thing. What I do see is that there is, at least online anyway, there can be an acute outcry from people about something that someone's done. And that person may be cast out. When we're talking about like folks like J.K. Rowling, for example, like, was she really canceled? Like, what'd she lose? Besides, she got into some arguments with people. Has she lost anything? She still has millions of dollars. Has anything ever actually happened to her? No. Like, sure, some people were angry at her on Twitter. And yeah, maybe Daniel Radcliffe, as an example, spoke out about it. So what is it actually? I do see a lot, as for those of you who are working with younger folks in organizational settings in terms of schools and stuff like that. I'm sure all of you can speak to this. And I just want to circle back to what Sheila was saying about the fear. Do not let your fear of people speaking out stop you from doing the right thing. You still have to be a leader in the space. You still have to be somebody who's able to step up, even though other people may still be angry at you, even when you did the right thing. It doesn't mean it's going to dissipate, but you for yourself have to know that you did the proper reflection and thought process, and that you followed through on what you felt like was the right thing based on the information that you had. And that is the best anybody can do. But you have to actually do the reflection and thought process. And that's oftentimes, especially white folks, where you don't do that. Sometimes there's just these reactions that are based on fear that are immediate. Oh, I'll just kick the person out, or I'll just do this, or it's just like, why don't you take a minute and actually think about what's going on here? Take some time to reflect. Go to therapy, go to the people you trust with these types of things, like read some books, like do the time to actually reflect on what happened. And I think you will come to some better conclusions. But the knee-jerk reactions, or we can't do this because I'm afraid, that lands us in a space where people don't feel like justice is actually happening. And what I said makes people even more angry in my experience. End of thoughts.
The other piece I wanted to add to this, and thank you for that, Sedina, for some reason, something you were saying made me think of this, is around what both of you have pointed out is maybe not the best use of the phrase cancel culture that we see being used, they kind of overused these days. To me, it's kind of backlash. To me, it's evidence of backlash for gains made. And we can often see that historically when groups make gains. We've seen Black identified people making gains, particularly during the pandemic, the organizing post the murder of George Floyd, right? There's been really, it seems to me, some significant organizational representation gains made in organizations at the very least having to have policies around anti-Blackness, policies around hiring Black identified people. So I have some employment equity approach, like on the surface, that I'm saying on the surface because I'm white, I don't know exactly what the environments, all these environments are going to be like for Black people, but there have been gains made. When we look at the Me Too movement around sexual violence, and we see and then the arts is no small place where that's been super public, and there's been really significant gains made as well by people calling out sexual violence in artistic spaces, and as a result of that, there is in some corners fear coming from I don't know what to do differently. I may get it wrong, but there's also backlash against because of basically a desire to continue those systems because they benefit people in power. So I think it's useful to add that to the discussion too, because sometimes people are maybe raising questions because they hear all this being talked about around them. So for example, when I will at times end up getting into conversations with men around being really concerned now that Me Too happened, that what if they're going to get called out too? What if something happens? And so I just end up having a conversation about consent. So what is it that you're actually concerned about? Are you concerned that you don't understand consent? Let's talk about that then. Let's talk about that so you make sure you really understand what consent is. And then that won't happen to you. And then you won't have to worry. So so if there's a willingness to do that, then you can move forward. If there's not, then it's a piece of backlash and wanting to maintain a suppressive system.
Thanks, Sheila. There are 3 questions in the chat room. I want to give a summary response, and then we should be taking a health break. So when you're in the room, it does happen that you can have your community agreements and something can happen. That's the time to stop. That's the time to stop. I can tell you what, in a rehearsal process that I was in, we had an individual who was coming out as being trans. And the rehearsal director kept using the term guys. And at one point, this person broke down. We stopped. We just stopped. Person left the room. One person, as well as myself, went to them. And we talked about, the rehearsal director should have, ideally, but didn't. And clearly this had an impact. And we had to then talk with the person about do we stop the rehearsal today and just, continue the conversation? Do you need to take a break and then maybe come back? We had to work with them to understand the next steps in the process. Part of that also came with we were going to be on tour. So the person wanted us to make sure that when we were on tour, this did not happen again by people who did not know them. But, the person looked like a woman, I want to say that. And we did. We made sure we had a very clear communication drafted with them to say, hey, we're coming next week, just so you know. Because there are going to be workshops, there are going to be community programming events and that kind of stuff. As Sedina was saying, let's think of our pronouns. We didn't name the person. We didn't want to have that person singled out. We just said, when we come in, let's just make sure that that's what we're doing. But to go back to the question, and this is the thing where I say with artists, we have to stop. We have to be human and say, wow, someone just got hurt here. If we were riding a bicycle or a car and we saw someone get hit, we would stop, more than likely, I would hope, and assist as much as possible. So we have to remember as artists, our hearts are on our sleeves. And when we end up into spaces together, and we need to take care of each other. And sometimes that means the process is about the relationship, not just the product of having something on stage. Pandemic and persons with disability. I mean, SAPAMO is not an organization who our primary mandate is not on persons with disabilities. So we have partners, Tangled Arts, right? And we sit with them often and say, hey, we're going to do this session. We want to make sure that it is accessible as possible. What kind of hints can you give to us in terms of how we organize it, format it? Do we bring on an ASL person? At what point should we do that? How can we involve you in the process? What funds do we need to make sure that this happens? Because, these folks, they don't, they shouldn't have to work for free and don't, as you know. So the consultation, and this is about building a relationship. I mean, I've known one of the leaders of Tangled Arts for some time. He was a former student of mine. He's now, I'm happy to see him in a lead role in Tangled. And I can just say, hey, Sean, let's have a conversation. We're doing this event. We want to make sure that, that we can reach out to communities that you're working with. And what do we need to put in place to make sure that they're able to participate as best as possible? So the answer can change depending upon, and I love when Seth and I use the term context. Everything is about what's happening in the moment you're in, not a global thing.
Yeah. I'll
Sorry,
add
go ahead,
something really
Seth.
quick to that I think that answers first question, the list, first two questions. What would it mean to center care in the work?
Yeah.
What would it mean for another thought from borrowing from a disability justice framework? What would it mean that we're all disabled in some way?
Mm-hmm.
So if that was the case, what is that like? Ask that question. If we're all in a process together, then it means that the process has to be right for everybody in the room.
Yep.
So how do we get to the process being right for everybody in the room? Well, we'd have to ask them what they needed instead of making any assumptions. And we make a lot of assumptions in theater that need to be broken down. And we pass them down from generation to generation. So we need to just stop doing that. And I know someone asked a question previously about like having a 2-week rehearsal process, which I'm like, yikes. What, like, who does that serve?
Man.
But it's like, well, that was only the money we could get. We'll find more money. Oh, that's going to take a few years. Then it takes a few years. Like, I know this is radical. And you're like, but then nothing. Who said we had to be making all this art all the time? And what does it mean if it's not serving us? If we get to do it for a week and people barely see it? Like, I have so many questions, y'all. And fundamentally, yes, we all need to pay our bills. I'm never going to, like, obviously bills need to be paid. But at the same time, it's just like, who is the work serving? That's all. That's what I'm going to say. And if it's not serving us, then why are we doing it?
Okay, why don't we take a break? We're about 3:37. Why don't we take a 15-minute break and come back around? I'm going to be right to the minute here, 3:52.
Yay, okay.
There are still a couple of questions which we will get back to. Thankfully, they're still in the Q&A, so we'll get back to them. And we'll begin after the break with Sheila presenting, and then we're going to just open up, as we've done here again, to conversation. Thank you for your questions and the sincerity in which they have been put forward. And that's the way we have a good conversation, is you can speak to, I love the phrase Sheila used, you can speak to what you might be tentative about, fearful about, etc. Because otherwise we really can't get to know each other. We're dodging around. What do we think about you? What are you hesitating about? You can imagine that doesn't make us feel very comfortable. One of the things, I'm from New York, and New Yorkers are very blunt. I remember my first experiences here in Canada, I had to learn, it took me years to learn the Canadian no. What does that mean? They don't get back to you. Well, New Yorkers say, no, man, not going to do it. That's all there is to it. Well, if I don't know that, I just get angry at the person saying, I asked you a question, God damn it. It doesn't increase my confidence if I don't get feedback that's real. Anyway, let's take a 15-minute break and come back at 3:55. Hi, folks. We'll get underway in just a minute or so. So as we're getting ready to rejoin, in the chat room, you have a couple of things that have been added. You have the agenda for today. Little fluctuations in times, but that's okay. You have the link to my presentation, the PowerPoints. You also have a link to the report that Kevin Ormsby prepared that I referenced. And you have a link to the Sapama website, which has on its page the Gathering Divergence. Somebody who asked questions about onboarding and developing relationships. And there'll be a couple of sessions at that will deal with those very questions from other people. Like I did say, Sedina will be on a panel with me, Ryan Cunningham, Anita La Selva, and then with CanStage and Luminato. But we also have stuff around networking coming up, around succession planning, and other things that are rather critical at this point in the arts movement. So we're going to turn it over to Sheila, and she'll lead the conversation for the next while. And then when she's done, we'll open the floor. There are still 2 questions in Q&A, so we will get back to them to make sure that everyone and others who have questions, you know where to put them. In the Q&A ideally, although we do search the chat just to make sure we don't miss anything. Sheila, over to you.
Thanks very much, Charles. So I'm going to be talking right now about community engagement. And I was introduced at the beginning as someone who teaches in the Community Engagement Leadership and Development Certificate Program at Toronto Metropolitan University. So when I was asked to talk about community engagement, I was thinking, I teach a whole course, I supervise practicum students. Where do I start? What do I do? But fortunately, the program I teach in, it's framed is within a social justice orientation to to community engagement practices. And then Sedina just did this for us. Sedina's work really set me up very well in which to embed the remarks that I want to make that I hope are helpful. And Charles's contribution focused on one or two really particular types of community engagement practices. So before I share my screen, I also just want to add that the field of what we is kind of now has a kind of a buzzword quality, community engagement. I think it came together as a field a couple of decades ago now. Time flies, so maybe just a little bit more in a couple of decades. Because when I did a planning degree many years ago, we had community development over here, and we had community consultations over here. We didn't have something called community engagement. But since then, there's now a whole field. And what I thought I would share with you today is a tool that is put together by the International Association for Public Participation that is used actually internationally. And it's actually it's a good practice tool, but it's a really good critical analysis tool when we really think of some of the really key questions that my colleagues have raised today, and some of you all have in your questions. So I'm going to share my screen now and show you that practice tool as I talk about it. So bear with me. Okay, so you may have to minimize your screen there, but anyway, here we go. So as I say, it's the IAP2 is the International Association for Public Participation. So if I say IAP2 again, that's what it means. So you can see that they say at the top that this spectrum was designed to assist with the selection of the level that's of participation that people want in any kind of process. And it's used internationally, and it's found in all kinds of plans around the world. So you can see it's a very technique-driven tool that people use. Okay, I'm going to go do an event. What do I want to? What do I want to say? You'll see on the left-hand side, there's what's my goal, public participation goal, and then below that, not only is what my goal is, what am I telling people? What am I promising people I'm doing with this event? Well, what I like to do is, in the work that I do, is encourage people to take this and not only use it as a set of tools or a rubric for coming up with tools, but think of it as a rubric for think about your organizational approach even to community engagement. So not just what you're committing to people in that event, or in our case, maybe that performance, but what are we committing to them in terms of our participation goal and our promise to that section of the public in terms of our overall organizational approach to community engagement. And we have seen today how the topic of decision-making has been front and central, as it rightly should be. And you'll see at the red line at the top of this, it says increasing impact on the decision. So I would say if I were to summarize what community engagement processes are about, if I were to summarize what this table is about, it is about decision-making processes and the degree to which people have agency in those, have control over those, and are able to participate in those. So let's just look at a couple of examples. So if I look at the inform end of this continuum on the left, you see that our participation goal is to give people balanced and objective information about a thing. So just imagine going to an event, just a random idea, might be an arts council meeting, coming up with a new granting program and just telling you what it's about, how to apply for it. There's a Q&A, and that's it. So you get good information about how to do that. So it's a very good informed type event for you. And the promise to the public attending that event is that we're just going to keep you informed, right? But if we move down the continuum a bit, let's say to involve, the goal is to work directly with people throughout a whole process to make sure people's concerns or aspirations are taken account of and really understood. So our promise to people then becomes that we're going to work with you to ensure that your concerns and aspirations are reflected in what we come up with, and provide feedback on how the input you gave us will have influenced the decision. So at the involved level on the continuum, we don't have final decision making on everything and anything if we're getting engaged in an event or an organization that says they're committed to involve. It's when we get into collaborate and empower that those are practices, community engagement practices that are at the social justice end of the IAP2 spectrum, when we take them up as approaches to practice and not just event by event techniques. And the reason I distinguishing between approach and techniques will probably become clear if I give you an example. So have you ever been to a really great event where there's wonderful speakers and say it's a social justice event of some type, and their breakout groups, which are really great. So you get to have some really good facilitated discussions. There, you get your ideas collected. On the before times would be on flip chart paper. Now it would be on the whiteboard. Get all these great ideas collected, and the group's going to take them away. And we call that a really empowering event because we all got to speak together. We came up with great ideas. But how empowering is it when we never see what happens with those ideas? And those people around the table, we may not meet again until the next time the organization or some other similar organization calls us together. So this is why I underscore the importance of thinking about approach. So we look at the goal of collaborate, the participation goal of empower. So the idea is that the organization is planning in advance. What is our goal in bringing people together, right? The goal of collaborate is to partner with the public in each aspect of decision, including the development of alternatives. And the goal of empower is to place final decision-making in the hands of the public. I would also add that as we move down this continuum from an EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging perspective, from a social justice perspective, we focus in on the public as the people who are most affected by a work that we are doing, our project we are doing, the people who have maybe been most historically marginalized from that project, the people who may be the subject matter of a piece that we want to perform. So these are the people in whose hands the final decision-making must be. So our promise to the public, if we're committing to empowering collaborative engagement, is that we will implement what you decide. So you can see how significant this is. Thinking this through, this can be a tool to think through what are we really promising to people that we're going to do, and what is our true goal? Because there's a lot of work out there in not just in arts organization, in all kinds of sectors where you will see. I'm going to use as an example unions, because as came up in my bio, I was an equity officer for a union local for almost 14 years. And I've been a union member of various unions. So you often see great union constitutions, great equity statements and constitutions that would give you the idea that my union is functioning at a collaborate or empower level, but there's only an AGM once a year and a GMM once a year. And I don't know the people on the executive very well, and it's really hard to cut in and vote for other people on the executive because everybody, who gets there has known everybody. So it's really functioning at the inform or consult level, although our documents say collaborate and empower. So that's how I say that this can also be used for a critical analysis tool in practice. And I was really thinking too about when Sedina wrapped up her talk about the framework of what we need to address in our industry, representation, content, and process, and how that really, to me, is part of making a commitment to do collaborative or empowering community engagement. That we have to think of each of those pieces, the who, the which sort, the who's involved, who's not involved, or the which stories, and also how we work together. Because to work at these ends of the continuum, continuum, collaborator and power. To work from a social justice perspective really generally means ongoing, a commitment to and actually ongoing organizational change. Because many organizations, we need to transform our structures, like the example of Union Local I just gave you. So it's policies and practices and people, who gets in a room and when and why and what happens and for how long do people get to be in the room. We need to let go of control, people who have institutional power. And we know from what we've heard today and what we probably already brought with our knowledge into the room, some of us, we know who are the people that have the power in those systems of oppression. People who have institutional power are the people that need to let go of control when we come into the collaborate and empower end of the spectrum. And it requires doing a lot of groundwork, such as do we ever think it's appropriate just to ask people to come and do a performance? Or do people that from an equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging framework that we're approaching, do we need people always to be part of, people most affected by a topic in the performance, part of the decision making of if and how that performance even will happen? So it requires the structural flattening of power dynamics, both formal and informal, because there's a lot of informal power wielded in organizations, so that leadership and decision making are shared, and if not actually handed over in certain instances, completely handed over to the artists whose engagement we seek. This can be, when we were preparing for this event, I got an opportunity to talk with Sedina and Charles a bit more, and I was hearing about how in your context, such preparation can be engagers being responsible for fulsome written agreements. I saw on your website that there's already agreements in place with engagement agreements with different organizations, and so all these agreements need to take into account the things we are raising today, the systems and how to undermine them and challenge them that we're raising today. Need to take into account, if we're thinking about community engagement, concerned about community engagement, what are our promises to people getting involved? And they need to prepare artists all the way through from the beginning, as Sedina said, way before you get into the rehearsal room. Otherwise, you can really end up with the things we're hearing people most concerned about: getting things wrong, tokenizing and stereotyping, or non-consensual practices. So I guess I'll just wrap up what these remarks and information I wanted to share with you, a bit of analysis on community engagement practices with something I was just reading in the report that the SPAMO report that Charles drew on in his presentation, that working across difference and collaborating with equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging in mind as central values requires that we understand what sharing or handing over decision making entails. And that's both of all of us and individuals. But what I read in the report was what they found in that research, our colleagues found when they did those researches, that when people do and have done this, the experience tends to be much more enriching, both and rewarding, both personally as well as creatively.
Thank you, Sheila. Floor open for questions, conversation. We'll first take, if there are any specific questions to Sheila, then we'll open up the Q&A again, because there are two questions that we did not get to, and we certainly want to honor that. Some people have noticed when you leave the room, the resources that we put there are no longer there. So I'm putting them back, but I understand also from Ryan's Randy, actually, that you'll have all of these materials when the video is prepared anyway. But if in case you need them immediately, I'm just putting them right back in the chat room. So any questions of Sheila at this point in time? All good? Okay, let's go back, because I do have some conversation I want to start between Sheila and Sedina. So maybe you can start with this one. There's a very general question. How does the industry move forward in this ongoing, we did talk about that with persons with disabilities, sorry. Let me move on from that. Yeah. How do we as artists affect the change? Bigger artists committing harm, still receiving funding. I find myself frustrated that I see companies around me doing the work I view as honest and deep, but not being given the resources to really invest long-term in developing new practices that would lead to better ways of working. That is a really important question. Maybe I'll start and tie in some of the conversations that Sheila and Sedina have talked about systemics and history. And I also want to really reference the first quote that I used from Erica Shaker about historical amnesia. You know, how many times have we heard, well, Barack Obama was the president of the United States, so there's no racism. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, right? And the outpouring of racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, you name it. No, but people were ready to say post-racial America, post-racial Canada. And so these systemic issues that just are so clearly embedded are things we need to kind of look at and struggle against. And those artists like Sedina, myself, and others, you know, we go against this wall of history that people want to say, well, that was then. This is now. Rather than looking at the cumulative effect of what it means to be persons of African descent have been in North America 500 years. What is the cumulative effect of that kind of anti-Black racism for that period of time, which despite Barack Obama, which despite certain people of African descent being in positions of power, still play itself out. And we see it in the arts. I was on a call before this meeting, and on the call is a man who I really admired because of his tenacity, Bakari Lindsay. He was the head of the Collective Black Artists for almost 30 years. COBA, as it's called, kind of doesn't really exist anymore. Why? Funding, right? An organization presenting Afro-diasporic contemporary dance that was at the leading edge. But I also remember my first time in Canada with Black Theatre Canada and Vera Kudrow, who literally, and I was in some of those meetings where the funders just literally went after her in some of the most racist ways imaginable, said she couldn't take the stress anymore. So Black Theatre Canada no longer exists. It took 12 or 13 years later before Obsidian appeared for another Black theater to appear in Toronto. So we have to ask, yes, there are people, but what ways are we talking to those people who disperse funding to say, you know, equity means outcomes. And it means outcomes in time frames that we can share and understand and see, we'll be there by 2025, whatever the date is, hopefully not 2030, 2050, but some clear timelines on how this change is going to take place. Not the language of this is what equity means and so on, or equity in application. No, equity is outcomes. That's what, you know, and we want to talk about it. That's what it is. So how do we begin to push the funders to recognize that's what's needed? Not just your polite language around what does equity mean and we're taking these things into consideration. Who's on the juries? What do the people in the juries know about other arts practices that are outside of the MLU? How do they get educated around it? Who are the staff? Are they familiar with the stuff that we're talking about? Those things are really important. And that's the systemic changes that need to come out to begin to remedy the historical impact of anti-Black racism, of anti-queer identities, of anti-Indigenous racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if we're not prepared as a community of artists, and I really sincerely mean this, because we are the ones who have to say to the funders, you know, if you've got privilege, then you're riding on it, right? To say, hey, we need to give up some of this because it's not fair. And it is harmful to our society. It's harmful to our society. Martin Luther King would say, it's not just illegal, as it is, if one was to complain, a discriminatory complaint, but it's immoral. It is really immoral. You cannot say we live in a society where all equal if some people clearly are not. And the evidence of it is more and more prominent these days. Pass it on to others if they want to, Sheila or Sedina want to chime in.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I think there's always this push and pull in social justice that I find personally. I'm sure all of us do, where do you change the system or do you do your own thing and make a new system? And it's such a difficult question, of course, that a person will spend their whole life responding to. But my thought is actually that both things need to happen at once, at the same time. And in fact, both things are happening at the same time. So in the case of the companies, organizations, people that you're like, wow, these people are doing great work and I support them, then I think continue to support them. And if you reach out to them and ask them what help they need that you could actually do, and I think that's as much as you can do. If you want to look at systemic change, as Charles has talked about, then it is a matter of getting more involved with, at least, because you can't do as much about the family foundations because they're going to fund what they're going to fund. But you can do a lot about in terms of government funding. That's government funding. So, the Canada Council does a strategic plan on a regular basis. You can contact the Canada Council and talk to them about their priorities, or when they have those surveys, fill them out. Figure out which ways that they, for instance, are, how they're changing how they fund and who they fund and their policies and stuff like that. It's the type of work that isn't long. That is very long, but it's worth it. And I mean, personally, I feel like, I know that the work that I'm able to do is the result of generations previous who have even opened the doors, because as Charles talked about, I really take that in as a lesson that like people weren't even able to get funding because their arts practices were not considered legitimate. And then I enter a landscape where actually, at this point, to be so transparent, I've sat on several juries at this point, like throughout my career for the last 10, 12 years. And that's been such a blessing and those particular grant managers have seeked me and others out because they know that, that we're from, traditionally marginalized groups. And so there's been a big change. So things are changing, and, it's just a matter of finding out, okay, where can I, as an individual, like, what can I do? Where are the spaces where I can intervene and to intervene in those spaces. But part of me is like a little bit woo and manifesting and all of that. I'm about it. And I'm just realizing more and more that like, it's probably better to focus sometimes your efforts on what is working and what is going well. So focus on those companies and give them the support. Because sometimes it's like the more energy we put into the things that aren't working, or the more energy we feel like, oh, well, then it's just like, yeah, it's true. Oh, well, but also, oh, yeah, like, true, the system may not be serving them, but I personally have been able to serve these particular organizations in this way. This is the best that I could do. And at the end of the day, you have to be happy with that. Yeah, and thoughts. Sheila, I'm so curious about what you have to say too, if you have anything. You don't have anything? Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute. I don't have anything to add.
There's a question in the chat room. I'll read it. How can we encourage theater organizations and companies to bring back health and safety measures, i.e. COVID? So in Ontario, we're now being encouraged to wear masks again. Live theater is now inaccessible for a lot of people, and that should be an equity issue. It's ableist to have in-person performances without either digital option or a mask requirement. It's harmful, immoral, and provides unequal access to the arts, but nobody's speaking up against it. Well, there are some people who are speaking up against it. So, for example, Native Earth Performing Arts has a mandate that if you want to use their theater, mask is required. You have to have evidence of your COVID shots. And that came through a community agreement. We're renting the space on November 29th, 30th, and December 2nd. And that's what we fully respecting the community's decision around that, because it can open space to others to feel comfortable. On the other hand, the digital one is a tricky one, because it means, do you have a venue? And who has venues? And if you have a venue, then do you have the capacity to really get the funds for live stream? And do you have the operators? And this is money. So we work out of the Citadel and Company on Parliament. And, I don't know how she's done it, Laurence Lemieux, but she's happened to have put together quite a bit of money to, redesign that site so they now have live stream. And it's up to the company coming in, though, has to be able to pay for it, right? They don't just do it for free. So that's a challenge in terms of technology, and another barrier that people are facing. A, do they have the space? And B, if they do have the space, do they have the capacities, the funds in place to offer live stream? And then they have the operators to do that. So it is a question. I totally agree that in this day and age, we should be doing live stream as much as possible to make things accessible. But I also know that the artists that we're talking about today, well, A, don't have venues mostly to begin with. And then B, if they do, and there are a few, probably do struggle with issues around capacity and live stream. And so those are things we have to really deal with in some ways. I'm not exactly sure how, without having access to venues that we would be able to control. I wanted to ask.
I have another thought about this.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Not even another, just to add, I agree with you, Charles. Like, it's a very difficult issue, and I'm going to say something. It's become a real divisive issue, this issue of masks. Personally, I'm pro mask. I wear them about it. What do you invest your energy and anger into? And is it helping you? Like, I hate to get Iyanla on people, but I just see sometimes some things like this that come up, that people, like, there's an anger that consumes a person's body sometimes with this kind of thing. And I get it. Is this ultimately the hill you're going to die on? And when do we radically accept that we don't always agree with people? And that this, what should be a health and safety issue, has now become a political issue, because it's very polarizing. And does this anger need to consume our bodies and consume our thoughts? Because I say this because social justice can kill people in that way. And I think, Sheila, you've seen it. I'm sure, Charles, you've seen it. People who were like so angry against whichever, and the anger is real and it's right, but it can't destroy you. So I just recommend some radical acceptance around the fact that you just fundamentally disagree with some theaters who aren't going to introduce this. And it's not exactly okay, but it's what we have for now. Yeah. And that maybe, you go to the theater, you make your choices based on individual, and nothing's to stop you from writing to any individual theater, especially the bigger ones, to say, you're not instituting this and it's hurting me. And trust me, they will listen. They do. Much as they care when people write into them. I know they do. And they'll take that into their considerations. But if it's truly beyond your control, which sometimes things truly are, then it isn't. I just feel like, don't let it consume your body. And like, as Ryan said, social justice burnout is real. And we've all seen it. And we've all seen people get so upset, not just about this, any number of things that's going to consume your life. And it is hurtful to your body. And when you are hurting your body, you can't actually do anything. So not just this, but anything, when you're this upset about it, I'm just like suggesting some social justice self-care and this doesn't solve the problems, but it at least puts you in a position to be able to A, better problem solve for yourself, and B, to just be healthier, because a certain level of anger and agitation is really bad for your health. End of thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, really important. Self-care is so critical. And yeah, exactly. Love
Huge.
that. Which battle are you willing to die for?
Right. And that, just to say that applies not to just this question, but sometimes I know some of us are sitting on these calls, especially those of us who've been in this industry for a while. We're sitting with a lot of anger at that time. Someone did so-and-so did this, blah, blah, blah. And I hear it and I feel it too. But I also am just like, okay, what can I do? But also I have to take care of myself, because this type of thing is actually what keeps us from moving forward on some level, because we don't have the energy to fight because we're too busy being angry and fighting with ourselves internally.
Mhm.
So I hate to get you, Yanla, but I did, and I'm going to end with that. Moving on.
Thanks, Sheila. Anything to add to that? No, good. So I wanted to ask, and because we've talked about everything from systems, social constructs, issues around power, but I wonder if you can talk about, we talk about what's normal, and I wonder if we can unpack that a bit. What does that term mean? Because it's like, oh, let's just go back. I mean, for example, with COVID, they say, well, we'll go back to what's normal. We'll go back to where we were, as if that's a good thing. So can we unpack that for a little bit? So from my point of view, when I look at what people call normal, I'll use an example. In the pre-COVID days, when a Toronto Jazz Festival would have a jazz festival, it's funny, I've never really gone other than to see Keith Jarrett. Anyway, and on the subways, they would have these posters. And on the posters, all I see are white faces. Right? The white saxophonist, the white pianist, the white guitarist, the white drummer, and white audiences. And it really is gendered, the men and the instruments, the women listening, applauding, and all that kind of, is that normal? It's ahistorical, what Erica said at the outset, jazz was founded by Black people. And B, what does it say in terms of gender constructions? The men are the active ones, the women are the passive ones, and come to the Toronto Jazz Festival. Right? So how do we disrupt that? Is that normal? Well, who has conceived of what is normal? Just want to throw that out there. So it's an everyday thing. If I can add to that, there are also the questions of terminology, which we gave you a resource for. And, I always love, and I'm going to probably not do this correctly, so I'm going to paraphrase. Marlene Norbesse-Philip, poet whom I love dearly, had a poem years ago where it says, first I was Negro, then I was colored, then I was Black, then I was Caribbean, then I was African Caribbean, and then I was Afro-diasporic. But my social circumstances remain the same over those 50 odd years. Right? So how do we come to terms with this parade of names where circumstances remain the same? Also, how do we come to terms with when people's name themselves? One of the biggest debates I've had in public forum is around the use of the term mad for a group of artists. Did I invent a term? No, they did. Am I not supposed to use it? Why not? They named it. It's the same as, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, or the term queer, etc. And yet, here you have the psychologist and the medical profession in the room saying, how dare you? How dare they, the ones who use this term, right, come up with it? So those are questions about who are we listening to and what is the language, so that when we say things, oh, that's normal to whom? What does normal mean? Who's included and excluded in that?
Yes. And the terms change. They just do. Native, Aboriginal, Indigenous, and then it'll change again. And you're right that, as Norbesi said, the conditions don't. Queer is a good one, Charles, because, there are some in, the LGBTQ plus community who really don't identify with that term because it was something used as a pejorative. And so, yeah, there's some people who really would never use the term and don't like its use. And I mean, no community is a monolith. We're just not. So some people, there might be a big group of people who agree on something and there's others who don't. And we just have to hold space for that.
Yeah, very good point. Because there are some who, I've grown up in North America, so the term Black was one that I grew up embracing. But I know sometimes some of my friends who are from, let's say, the Trinidad or the islands or from the continent don't see themselves as Black. Why? They never had till they got here, right? So those are very big, different. I mean, so then who are we talking about? I mean, and that's the whole thing of unpacking when I say what is normal. I think somebody put in that thing, I think normal is a word we need to retire. I agree. So how do we open up to a plethora, what we would call a pluralist, a heterogeneous way of approaching, where self-identification comes from the people who choose to identify themselves. I remember once sitting down with Kim Murray, who was the executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Kim's a very, very astute lawyer, had head up Aboriginal legal services for quite some time before taking this on. And in all the consultations that the TRC had, various individuals who came forward used different names to identify themselves. And so she just said, she was just concerned with their stories, not whether or not they called themselves Indian, Native, Indigenous, Aboriginal, or their nation name. What was important were their stories and having those on the record, however they would self-identify. I mean, she wasn't going to ask the commission, challenge them because they're not using the term Indigenous or Mohawk. No, it was their stories. And when she heard the stories, the heartbreak, right? So that's the question of, again, how do we hear? And how do we not simply say, Sedina and I look kind of the same, so we both would see ourselves as Black. We may not. Right? So those are just questions, I think, to consider in unpacking that term.
I love the term Black, but I
So
know that it's within a North American context. And I feel like similar to queer, it's a reclaimed term because in the sense that I always have to point out that Black people didn't create that term. We didn't even categorize ourselves that way. White people did. We didn't create race as a construct. It prior to colonization, there was hundreds of groups on the continent of Africa, hundreds, and there still remains hundreds, so their relationships were not based on necessarily the amount of pigment in their skin. Relationships were based on all kinds of other factors. But they named us that in order to create the system of white supremacy where they could then dehumanize various groups in order, to justify the violence and the labor extraction, the genocide. But here we are in 21st century with this term. And so to reclaim it means to make it something our own. And I feel, I stand on the shoulders of many people who came before who continue to define what it means for us as we move forward to our Afrofuturist future, our Black future. Then now we reclaim it and we move forward, right? And there's people in the world who may not identify with this term for various reasons, even if they may fall into the category of it. And that's okay.
I have a question in the chat. In the Q&A. Finding common agreements around rehearsal norms like being on time, when, what, respect. Yeah, I have to say I did put in the chat room the Sapamo Gathering Divergence event. It's a series of things. So the one that we're doing and setting will be on that panel, we're going to have more time, especially with Luminato and CanStage, because we're actually recommending they put this into practice, is what is a common agreement around rehearsal? So just quickly, one of the things we're saying to them, it starts long before the rehearsal begins. It starts the first time an artistic director reaches out to an artist or an artist agent and says, I would like for you to perform in our space. However, before you get here and sign an agreement, let's have a conversation about what that means. Because we need to understand you, and we want you to understand us so that we can develop a common agreement, not just here, sign this contract, but let's have a contract that we work on together. So it works, and we can hold ourselves accountable to it before they even enter the room. Lay this out very clearly. We want to make sure this works well. And in that, you might find, hey, what do you need from our end as the presenter bringing you in to make, how do we make the space safe? Who's coming into the room? What kind of agreements do you have in your own company about how you work? So for example, one of the challenges that Luminato and CanStage had in their work New Monuments that was produced for CBC was they brought in a commercial hip hop artist to direct a number of dancers who work in an anti-oppressive environment. You can imagine a commercial hip hop artist is, this is how I want it done. I have a big name. You should be happy to be on my program, which hip hop artists were because they know this guy. And the others were like, well, where do we have a say in how this is being constructed and worked? And it didn't work so well. So those are questions that it doesn't matter who it is. Have that conversation before you even think about entering a room to say, okay. And then the question around artist care, that is so important these days. We're all run by this rule of 3 hours or 4 hours or a commercial, a rehearsal day and so on, without thinking that, hey, if you're, you need breaks here and there, and you need breaks not just when it's assigned at a certain time, but to say, I have to step out here. Okay, or I have a question here. Those are really critical to be able to enter those conversations and to make sure that people who are engaging in the work know that that is their right to assert, I need to raise an issue. I have to take a break now. I'm a bit overwhelmed at the moment. I'm not getting this. I feel this is offensive or rude or whatever it may be, to not get, defensive, but to have the conversation, is so critically important. And there are a number of things that presenters can put together in their teams. It shouldn't just be the artistic director. It should be the producers, the lighting designers, the sound designers, the stage managers. We're all familiar with the work that's coming in, with the artists that are coming in, and can actually meet with them and say the first rehearsal, just to get to know each other and to say, here's my role, responsibility, etc. You can reach out to me on this, that, or the other, email, whatever, and to make sure that team is meeting regularly to update themselves on how is the process going. Is there something we need to do to support the artists? Care is so critical because we all want, I'm sure presenters want to put something on stage that is impactful, that generates audience, not just for that show, but let's say for the one, oh, wow, I can trust this presenter because they do good work. Well, the care comes into that. I have to be honest, I think that if people take care of themselves, the end product is a lot better than just ramming it through the normal 3 hour, 4 hour, 6 hour rehearsal thing, and then on stage where everybody's exhausted and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the only thing I want to say is, Sheila, I'd love for you to speak to this, like working across difference. I think of community engagement, which I've also done and which I love, and working with people who are coming from different work cultures or inviting people to work together who have to get a shared vocabulary. And I feel like, yeah, what lessons do you have? I'm sure you have many.
Well, mostly I'm sitting and percolating and listening because I'm outside of your specific context, and I was thinking about, I guess when I'm thinking about the question about going back to normal, I didn't contribute it to anything to that because I didn't feel like I had anything positive to say. Because I feel like in some ways I initially had this hopeful feelings in the pandemic that we would create something new because we were forced into these circumstances that we were not all in together, but that everybody was experiencing in their own way from a marginalized position or less marginalized position or more. But it was all a new kind of, most of it was very, very new for quite a number of us. And I was just hoping we'd create something new and better out of that. And what I'm seeing is a lot, kind of a lot of frustration and demoralization, and I feel like we've lost some ground on social justice terms there as a result of the pandemic. So we're not kind of together as much as we could be. And our colleagues' comment about like basically ableist exclusion, I for one thing, I had hopes that pandemic would increase inclusion around people with disabilities because of how we all and many of us, not all of us, not service workers, not healthcare workers, ended up online together, so I hope that would allow us to embrace. But I don't think that's necessarily happening. There's those who can go back in person are fed up and just wish to. So I'm also concerned that we've kind of gone back from, anti-racism to, cultural competency. Just learning how to talk across difference, learning how to relate to people, say for my racial, socially constructed racial location as white, learning how to competently relate to people across difference. And so that, I think there is, I think there is some of that happening. And I had a kind of a cool resource that I thought maybe I just kind of screen share quickly that kind of addresses the difference between some of these terms in relation to cultural competency. Just let me get back to, sorry, sharing slides momentarily. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay, from current slide. Still from current slide. Oops, back. So this is from an article on it's from an article, What is Indigenous Cultural Safety and Why Should I Care About It? It's an article used in one of the courses in the certificate that I teach in. The article teaches people about the concept that comes out of Indigenous healthcare setting on cultural safety. And if people remember at all, Joyce Echiquan, who basically filmed her own killing by neglect on Facebook Live, an Indigenous woman in Quebec just about 2 years ago now. We'll appreciate the need for cultural safety in relation to healthcare. But I think it translates outside of healthcare. So, because we can't actually continue to build on anti-racism and anti-oppression practices until I think we kind of those of us who need to get some of these concepts. So we could start at cultural awareness, would be an attitude that includes just knowing that there's differences between cultures, just knowing it, right? Sensitivity that recognizes that the difference between cultures, that those are important to acknowledge, for example, in healthcare or any setting. It's just important that we acknowledge. Competency would be focusing on our ability to get skills, knowledge, and attitudes to work in more effective and respectable ways with Indigenous, Black, and people of color. And I would just say we can think of culture in other terms too, because we could think of, what we were talking about Sedina's raising around pronouns, and there just being a culture of acceptance, a cultural sensitivity around that there are multiple pronouns, and we need to be aware of that and sensitive to learning how to use them. And I like cultural humility being approached to relating to people based on a humble acknowledgement of oneself as a learner when it comes to understanding a person's experience. And I appreciate that as a lifelong process, because cultural competency, when we used to be kind of taught that as a thing in of itself without this framework, is like it would be something we could be filled up on, could know all the cultures, and then it might be Emnard V.C. Phillips' quote, actually, Samosas and Steele's band approach to relating to, for white people to relating to Indigenous racialized people, that makes us cultural competent when we, can relate to understand all the food and all the dance and that sort of thing. But humility just takes us like, this is a lifelong process. Like, there's such a rich diversity that we have to just be quiet, be humble, and relate to what we're learning from somebody else, or somebody else as a group of people. And then cultural safety is an approach that considers how social and historical contexts, which is really in line with the social justice message we've been hearing today, as well as structural and interpersonal power imbalances shape everyday access and inclusion experiences. So as I say, that comes out of Indigenous experience and healthcare system, but I think it really resonates well in what we're talking about today in equity, diversity, inclusion in the arts, and always remembering that safety is defined by those who we are seeking, who are receiving, in this case, the service, but who we are seeking to engage with.
Thanks, Sheila.
Yeah, there's something I want to add to that too, Sheila. This is so useful, those terms. I think a first step, a really important two first steps as theater artists and arts workers, is for us to break down what our culture actually is. And I think, especially if you're in a position to be a space creator or you're in a leadership position, there's a certain amount of introspection you have to do to be like, what are my standards? What are my standards? What am I expecting from people? Do you know what I mean? And from there, then if we're going to look at things through a social justice lens, like Sheila, you provided those terms for us to say, okay, so this is my culture. Am I expecting everybody to share it? Is there space for these things to shift? There needs to be space for things to shift. But I think a huge thing that's problematic about our industry is that we operate on these standards that nobody ever talks about, but we only talk about them when people don't do them. And so we need to actually just take the time to examine what it is we're expecting of each other, hence the community agreement or room agreement for that process, to just examine, it's like, what are we expecting of each other? These unspoken rules that we just pass down from person to person. And then look at, okay, are these guidelines ones that we want to continue, and to what end? This comes into play, especially when working with, working with racialized and Indigenous communities who may not have the same relationship to these kinds of standards for various reasons, or even just like us as theater artists working with musicians or like really working with, like, Charles, you do this all the time with Wind in the Leaves, like working with dancers, musicians, poets. Like, actually, we all have our own little subcultures of how we expect to work together. So but it bears examining as to what they are to begin with, because I think we are walking in with a series of ideas of how things should be. So why do you think they should be that way? And where did that come from? And then even further, what are like the white supremacist capitalist frameworks that informs those standards to begin with? Who decided over time? And that self-awareness is actually one of the most important steps. And that's what we talk about when we really talk about white supremacy, is that it's like a big thing about it is that no one ever wants to actually talk about what it is. It's just like, oh, that's just the way we do things. And you're like, but why? And do you even realize you're doing things that way? Or is it because it's always been accommodated in a particular way that you are just like, oh, well, that's how things are done? It's like, no, that's not necessarily how things are done. They don't have to be that way. It's up to you. It's up to us. We've all like entered into a contract of things being that way, but they don't actually have to be. And especially if you're in a leadership position, you can change that. And even if you're not, you know, it's up to us to really examine what is happening right now in order to talk about how we would want to shift it and why. End of thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you, Sedina, and thank you, Sheila, and thank you too. We are at 4:51, and I think we've had a very full time this afternoon. So we may want to check out now and get a couple minutes back in our lives. I know it gets dark a little bit earlier. The way I always find out about it is, I love these, my dog wakes up. I'm happy for the extra hour of sleep. She's not. I'm like, whoa, this is the time. Let's go. So let's close on today. And I really want to thank the interpreters for your skill in getting our words. And I think we were okay in our pace. And I'm going to turn it back to Ryan, who I think is going to close us down for the afternoon. I want to thank Canadian Actors Equity for inviting us in for the session. I'm sure you can get our emails from them if you need to get in touch with us. Happy to respond to anything after this is done this afternoon. Ryan, over to you.
I don't even know where to start with this thank you. What an impressive afternoon of education and learning and deep conversation and open dialogue. It was, I know I learned so much that I'm carrying forward in my practice, and I'm sure everybody else who is here asking questions and participating in the chat will as well. So Charles, thank you. Sheila, thank you. Sedina, thank you. And of course, as always, extra big thank you to our interpreters. Big round of applause. They deserve it. It's all of us who are members of Actors Equity, we all kind of fall into the same trap of speaking quickly. It's a note that I always get in rehearsal or when we're in previews. Directors are always like, Ryan, slow down. Ryan, slow down. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. As Randy said earlier, this session will pop up on our YouTube in the not too distant future. And with that, we will see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us.